Jolene woke the way she always did. Not gradually, not softly, but all at once like a switch flipping inside a house that had been dark for too long. Her eyes opened, and the first thing she did before breathing deeply, before shifting under the thin comforter, before anything else was listen. The house on Sycamore Street had its own language at night. The refrigerator hummed a low, tuneless note in the kitchen. The furnace clicked on and off with the patience of something ancient and tired. The pipes in the bathroom wall ticked when they cooled. And beneath all of that, underneath the ordinary sounds of a house settling into another October morning, there was Rick. His breathing came from the back bedroom. Slow, heavy. The breathing of a man who slept deeply because he had never in his life been afraid of what might come through the door. Jolene listened to it the way a sailor listens to the sea. Not for comfort, for information. She sat up and placed her bare feet on the cold floor. The carpet had worn through in patches near the bed, and the hardwood beneath it was the kind that remembered every creak, every step, every path a body had taken across it over too many years. Jolene had memorized where the silent places were. She could cross this room in the dark without making a sound, and she had done it more times than she could count. She moved to the hallway. The door to Levi's room was open 2 inches the way he liked it. She pushed it gently and saw him sleeping on his side, one arm around a stuffed bear that had lost most of its fur and all of its left eye. Levi was 7. He slept with the focused seriousness of a child who understood in some instinctive way that preceded language that sleep was the safest place he had. Jolene watched his chest rise and fall. She counted 3 breaths the way she did every morning, a small ritual that meant nothing to anyone but her. 3 breaths. Still here. Still breathing. Still mine. She closed the door to its 2-inch gap and moved down the hall to the second bedroom. The door was open. The bed was empty. Jolene stood in the doorway and felt the floor tilt beneath her. Not physically. The house didn't move. But something inside her shifted the way the ground shifts before it gives way entirely, that terrible half-second between standing on solid earth and falling. Wyatt's bed was made. Not slept in and then made. Made. The pillow was straight. The blanket was flat. The shoes that usually sat beside the bed, the sneakers with the double-knotted laces because the boy was always trying to make things last, were gone. Jolene put her hand on the doorframe. She did not breathe. She stood perfectly still and calculated the distance between this doorway and the front door, and then between the front door and the street, and then between the street and anywhere a 10-year-old boy might go at. She looked at the clock on the wall in the hallway, 6:47 in the morning, on a Thursday in late October. She knew where he had gone. She knew it the way she knew the sound of Rick's breathing and the location of every silent floorboard. She knew it because Wyatt had told her 3 weeks ago, standing in this very hallway with a bruise on his jaw that was already turning yellow at the edges. "I'm going to tell someone," he had said, not crying, not angry, just stating it the way you state something that has passed from intention into inevitability. "Wyatt," she had whispered, "please. He's going to hurt Levi next, you know that?" She had known that. She had known it the way, the season is changing by the weight of the air, by the color of the light, by the way certain things that used to be green have gone brown at the edges. "I'll handle it," she had told him. "You said that before." And she had looked at her son, 10 years old, standing in a hallway, in a house that should have been safe. And she had seen in his face the exact moment when a child stops believing that the adults in his life are capable of protecting him. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no sound. It was just a small, quiet closing, like a door being shut very gently by someone who has decided that knocking is no longer worth the effort. She had not handled it. And now the bed was empty. Jolene moved back down the hallway. She checked the bathroom. Empty. The kitchen. Empty. She went to the front door, her steps quickening, despite every instinct telling her to stay quiet, and she found it locked. The deadbolt. The chain. Both engaged from the inside the way Rick set them every night before he went to bed, because Rick believed that the world outside this house was the dangerous one. She unlocked the deadbolt. She reached for the chain, and then she stopped. Because behind her down the hallway, Levi was still sleeping. And if she opened this door and went after Wyatt, she would be leaving Levi alone in a house with Rick. And if Rick woke up before she got back, if Rick woke up and found one son missing and his mother gone and only the 7-year-old left. Jolene's hand stayed on the chain. Her fingers curled around the brass slider, and she held it, feeling the cold metal warm slowly against her skin, and she stood in the gray light of a house that had become a kind of prison. She had walked into voluntarily and could not seem to walk out of, and she chose. She left the chain in place. She went back to the hallway. She sat on the floor outside Levi's door, pulled her knees to her chest, and wrapped her arms around them and waited. This was the shape of Jolene's bravery. And if you did not know her, if you did not understand the particular math that a woman in her position had to do every hour of every day, you might have mistaken it for surrender. You might have looked at her sitting on that floor and thought she was weak, that she was passive, that she was the kind of woman who lets things happen to her children because she cannot be bothered to do what needs to be done. You would have been wrong, but you would not have been alone in thinking it, because the world is full of people who judge the decisions of a woman trapped in a burning house without stopping to notice that someone else set the fire and locked the doors. Jolene waited. The clock in the hallway ticked towards 7. She thought about Marcus. She always thought about Marcus in these moments, in the early hours when the house was quiet and the world was still, and the weight of everything pressed down on her like water above a swimmer who has gone too deep. Marcus, who had been her husband for 8 years. Marcus, who had built the shelf in Wyatt's room and mowed the lawn every Saturday and fallen asleep on the couch during football games with Levi curled against his side like a cat who had found the warmest spot in the world. Marcus, who had gone to work on a Tuesday morning 2.5 years ago and had not come home. The foreman had called at 3:14 in the afternoon. Jolene remembered the time because the clock on the kitchen wall was the first thing she looked at after hearing the words, as if the time mattered, as if knowing the exact minute her life had been divided into before and after would somehow help her navigate the territory of after. There had been a fall. A scaffolding failure at the construction site on the east side of town. 3 men had gone down. 2 had survived. Marcus had not. And the world, which had been steady and ordinary and filled with the small, reliable patterns that make up a life, had tilted on its axis and not come back. She had been 31 years old with 2 sons and a mortgage and a job at the county clerk's office that paid enough to cover groceries but not enough to cover grief. She had managed for 4 months. She had managed the way women in her situation manage, by reducing the world to its smallest necessary tasks. Get up, feed the boys, get Wyatt to school, keep Levi occupied, pay what you can, ignore what you can't, go to bed, repeat. She had managed by not thinking about the future, because the future without Marcus was a field with no edges and no landmarks, and she could not afford to look at it directly. She sat on the hallway floor and thought about all of that, and she waited for Rick to wake up. At 7:14, she heard his feet hit the floor in the back bedroom. She heard him cough, once the dry morning cough that meant he'd been drinking the night before, not heavily, just enough to leave residue. She heard him walk to the bathroom. The toilet flushed. The sink ran. Then his footsteps came down the hall. He appeared in the hallway wearing jeans and a white undershirt, his hair uncombed, his eyes still carrying the flat, unfocused look of early waking. He was big, not tall, but broad, with the soft bulk of someone who had once been physical and had since let it go to something harder to name. He looked at Jolene on the floor, and his expression didn't change, because Rick had learned a long time ago that his face was the first thing people read, and he had become very good at controlling what it said. "What are you doing on the floor?" he said. "Couldn't sleep." He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then walked past her toward the kitchen. She heard him fill the coffee pot. She heard the machine click on. She heard him open the refrigerator and close it again without taking anything out, the way he did when he was thinking. She stood up. She smoothed her shirt. She walked into the kitchen and sat at the table and waited for what she knew was coming. "Where's Wyatt?" Rick said. He was standing at the counter with his back to her, pouring coffee into a mug that had a crack running down one side that he refused to throw away because it was his, and he didn't believe in replacing things that still function. "I think he went to the backyard. He's been doing that early morning thing again." She said it calmly. She had become an excellent liar over the past 2 years, not because she was naturally dishonest, but because dishonesty had become a survival tool, the same way a certain kind of animal develops camouflage, not to deceive but to avoid being eaten. Rick didn't move. He stood at the counter and took a sip of coffee, and then he set the mug down with the careful deliberateness that Jolene had learned to watch for, because it was the difference between a normal morning and the other kind. "Backyard," he said. "Mm-hmm." Rick walked to the back door. He opened it. He looked out into the small yard with its chain-link fence and its patchy grass and its single tree that had dropped most of its leaves onto the ground where they lay in a soggy brown carpet. The yard was empty. He closed the door. He locked it. Then he turned around. Jolene. His voice had not changed. That was the thing about Rick that Jolene understood better than anyone. He did not escalate the way other men did. He did not move from calm to loud the way a storm moves across a field. He stayed calm. He stayed quiet. And somehow that was worse because at least a storm gave you warning. At least a storm let you hear it coming. Where is the boy? I don't know. She said it because there was no lie left that would work, and because the truth in this case was also true. She did not know exactly where Wyatt was. She knew where he was going, but that was different. Rick crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. He didn't touch her. He put both hands flat on the table and leaned forward, and his face was very close to hers, and his breath smelled like coffee and something underneath coffee that was older and colder and had nothing to do with what a person drank in the morning. I'm going to ask you one more time. I don't know where he is. Rick straightened. He picked up his keys from the counter. He picked up his phone. He walked to the front door, and Jolene watched him check the deadbolt and the chain, and she saw the calculation in his eyes as he turned back to look at her. You stay here, he said. You and Levi stay right here. You understand? Yes. He undid the chain. He undid the deadbolt. He stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him, and Jolene heard the truck start in the driveway. She heard it back out. She heard it turn onto Sycamore and accelerate toward Route 12, and the sound of it faded slowly the way sounds do on a quiet street in the morning when the air is cold and still and carries everything farther than it should. And then Jolene got it up and went to the front door and tried the handle, and it turned. He had not locked it from outside. He had been in a hurry. She stood at the open door and looked at the street. It was empty. The sky was the color of old concrete. The trees along the sidewalk were stripped bare, their branches reaching upward like hands asking for something they were never going to receive. She could leave right now. She could take Levi and walk out of this house and down this street and towards something that was not this. She could do it right now in this exact moment while Rick was gone and the door was open and the morning was quiet. She stood there for 11 seconds. She counted them. Then she closed the door, sat on the couch, and pulled Levi's blanket into her lap and held it and waited. 20 minutes later, she heard the truck again. The engine sound growing, then stopping in the driveway. A door opening and closing, footsteps on the porch, not coming in, just pausing. Then the sound of a key in the deadbolt, the click of the lock engaging. Then the back door, the same sound, the same click. Then the truck again pulling away and accelerating, gone. He had come back to lock the doors. He had driven around looking for Wyatt, and at some point during the search, he had realized that he'd left the house unlocked, and he had come back specifically to seal it shut before continuing. Not to check on Jolene, not to check on Levi, to lock the doors. Because Rick understood in the practical way that controlling men understand these things, that an unlocked door was a variable he could not afford. Jolene sat on the couch and listened to the deadbolt click, and she thought 20 minutes ago the door was open. 20 minutes ago, I could have walked out, and I didn't, and now I can't. Because Jolene had learned something over the past 2 years that people who have never lived with a Rick do not understand. Leaving is not a single decision. It is not a door you walk through once. It is a door you have to walk through 100 times in your mind before your body will follow, and even then, even when your feet are moving and the street is under you and the air is on your face, there is a voice that says, go back. Go back. It won't be that bad this time. Go back. And sometimes that voice wins, not because you are weak, but because that voice has been practicing longer than your courage has. 8 miles to the east on Route 12, the morning was moving at a different pace. The diner sat between a gas station and a tire shop, the kind of establishment that had been built in the 70s and had weathered every decade since, with the stubborn indifference of a building that knew it served a purpose and didn't care whether anyone admired it. The sign out front read Millie's, though. No one named Millie had owned it in 30 years. The parking lot was half empty. 3 motorcycles sat near the entrance chrome catching the dull gray light. Inside, Earl sat in a booth near the window with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm 20 minutes ago, and he hadn't noticed because he was watching the road. Not for any reason, not because he was expecting anything. He watched roads the way other men watch television, out of habit, out of a lifetime spent moving across them, out of the particular restlessness of a man who had been riding motorcycles for 40 years and still hadn't found what he was riding toward. Earl was 58. His beard was gray and close-cropped. His hands were thick and scarred in small places that each had a story he would never voluntarily tell. He wore a leather jacket that was older than some of the people in this diner, and jeans that had been washed so many times they'd forgotten what dark blue looked like. He was the kind of man that certain people crossed the street to avoid, and other people crossed the street to stand next to. And the difference between those two groups usually came down to whether they had ever needed help from someone who looked like they could actually provide it. Shane Boone was eating eggs. Boone was the kind of man who approached breakfast the way a carpenter approaches a job. Methodical, focused, uninterested in conversation until the task was complete. He was Earl's age, give or take, with a face that looked like it had been carved from something hard and then worn down by weather, until all the sharp edges had been replaced by something more patient. He had hands that could fix an engine in the dark, and a voice that he used so sparingly that when he did speak, people tended to pay attention the way they pay attention to the first crack of thunder after a long silence. Across the table, Sawyer had his phone out, scrolling through weather reports with the intensity of someone who treated meteorology as a matter of personal importance. Sawyer was the youngest of the three, though youngest was relative in this group. He was 49, lean and careful, with the particular awareness of a man who had spent 12 years in the military before deciding that the discipline he'd learned there could be applied to more interesting purposes. He noticed things. He noticed exits and entrances and the weight distribution of strangers in the exact moment when a room's energy shifted from neutral to something else. Might snow later, Sawyer said. Might not, Earl said. Clouds say otherwise. Clouds say a lot of things. This was the rhythm of their mornings when they were on the road. Small talk that wasn't really talk at all, just the sound of three men who had known each other long enough that silence and speech had become interchangeable. They were 3 days into a ride from Pennsylvania to Kentucky, taking the long way, because the long way was the point, and they had stopped at Millie's because the coffee was cheap, and the booth by the window had a view of the road, and Earl liked to watch the road while he drank his coffee, and there wasn't much more to it than that. The door opened. Earl glanced up. A woman with a toddler on her hip came in and sat at the counter. The waitress poured coffee without being asked. The door closed. The diner settled back into its hum. Then it opened again. The boy stood in the entrance for a moment before moving. He was small, thin in the way that wasn't about genetics, but about something else, and he wore a blue hoodie zipped to the chin. His jeans were torn at both knees. His sneakers were a size too big. Laces double knotted the way kids do when they're trying to make something last. He scanned the room, not the casual scan of a child looking for a parent. The systematic scan of someone cataloging exits and threats and deciding which table presented the least risk and the most potential. His eyes landed on Earl. Something about the boy's expression stopped Earl mid-sip. It was not fear exactly. It was something more organized than fear. It was the face of a person who had made a plan and was executing it step by step, and had reached the step that required approaching a table of strangers and asking for something. The boy walked over. He stopped a few feet away and waited as if he'd been taught that barging in was dangerous. He stood with his hands in his hoodie pockets and his weight on the balls of his feet, and his chin slightly raised, the posture of someone who is ready to move quickly if the need arises. "You need something," Earl said. "Can you tell me how to get to the police station?" Earl set his mug down. Beside him, Boone had stopped eating. Sawyer put his phone face down on the table. The question was simple. The bruise along the boy's jaw was not. It was yellow-green at the edges, maybe a week old, the kind of bruise that sits on a child's face like a stain that everyone can see and no one is supposed to mention. The boy didn't touch it. He didn't seem aware of it, which meant it was ordinary to him, and that was the worst part. "There's one about 4 miles east," Earl said. "On Route 9, you can't miss it." "Thank you." The boy turned to go. He turned with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to complete transactions quickly, to take up as little space and time as possible to get what he needed and leave before anyone had a chance to change their mind or their mood. "Hey," he stopped. You walking there, a pause. The kind of pause that happens when a person is deciding how much truth to offer. Yes, sir. Earl studied him. The blue hoodie was thin for the weather. The boy's hands were red at the knuckles, not from fighting but from cold. He'd been outside for a while already. The morning air had a bite to it that would only get sharper as the hours passed, and this child was proposing to walk 4 miles in it. That's 4 miles. I know. Boone leaned forward slightly but didn't speak. Sawyer's hands were flat on the table, fingers spread, the gesture so subtle it was barely visible, but Earl knew what it meant. It meant Sawyer was alert. Sit down, Earl said. The boy didn't move right away. He looked at the door, then back at Earl, doing the math that children in his situation always did, the quiet arithmetic of trust, which was really the arithmetic of risk. Which stranger is safer, the one behind me or the one in front of me? Just for a minute, Earl said. I'll get you something warm. The boy sat, not across from Earl, but at the edge of the booth, angled toward the exit. His back was not against the seat. His feet were flat on the floor. He was seated, but he was not settled, and the distinction between those two things was something Earl recognized, because he had sat like that himself once, a long time ago, in a different booth, in a different state, when he was younger than this boy and older than anyone that age should have to be. The waitress brought hot chocolate without being asked. She was the kind of woman who read a room the way a musician reads a score, picking up every note that others missed. She set the mug down and gave the boy a quick, warm look and moved away without hovering, without asking questions, without any of the well-meaning attention that would have made the boy close up. She just put warmth in front of him and left. And the boy wrapped both hands around the mug but didn't drink. He was watching the parking lot through the window. What's your name? Earl asked. Wyatt? How old are you, Wyatt? 10. Where do you wish him? The boy looked at him carefully, measuring. The measuring look of a child who has learned that information is currency and that giving it away too freely has consequences. Sycamore Street, about a mile from here. Earl nodded slowly. So you walked a mile to ask for directions to the police station? It wasn't a question. Wyatt seemed to understand that. Yes, sir. Why not call them? I don't have a phone. Use the diners. Something tightened in the boy's jaw, the bruised jaw. Earl watched the muscle work under the discolored skin and felt something old and heavy shift inside his chest, something that had been there for a long time, buried under years and miles, and the particular kind of forgetting that isn't really forgetting at all, but just a very good imitation of it. I didn't want to do it from somewhere he could find out. The table went quiet. Outside, a truck pulled into the lot and Wyatt's eyes tracked it immediately. Fixed, unblinking. The total attention of a prey animal that has heard a sound in the brush. The truck parked. A woman in a down vest climbed out and walked toward the diner entrance. Wyatt watched her the whole way, then relaxed only when she sat at the counter and opened a menu without looking their direction. Earl waited until the boy's shoulders came down. He had learned over many years that the moments after someone relaxes are the moments when they're most likely to speak honestly, because the body's release gives the mind permission to follow. Who's he? Wyatt picked up the mug and took a slow sip. Then he set it back down and looked at the table. Not at Earl, at the table. At the scratched surface where 100 people had set down 100 mugs and left behind a map of rings and marks that no one would ever read. My mom's boyfriend, his name is Rick. And Rick's the reason you're going to the police station. Wyatt didn't answer that directly. He said, my brother's still in the house. Boone sat back. Sawyer set his hands in his lap. Earl kept his eyes on the boy. How old's your brother? 7. Where's your mom? Something moved across Wyatt's face. Not grief, something older than grief. The kind of expression that settles in when a child has had to recalibrate what normal looks like. When the baseline has shifted so far from where it should be that the child no longer remembers what the original baseline was, only that it existed once and was different. She's there too, but she won't leave. Earl looked at Boone. Boone looked at Sawyer. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. There are conversations that happen between people who have known each other long enough that speech becomes unnecessary, where a look carries the weight of a paragraph and a nod carries the weight of a decision. When did you leave? Earl asked. About an hour ago. I waited until Rick went to the back of the house. Your brother wanted to come. Levi wanted to come. I told him to stay. I didn't know how far I'd have to walk, and Levi, he's not. He's small for his age, and he doesn't have good shoes. The detail about the shoes landed in the booth like something with weight. Good shoes, a 7-year-old who doesn't have good shoes in October. Earl filed it in the place where he kept things that mattered and moved on. Did Rick see you leave? No. Is he the kind of man who checks? Wyatt met Earl's eyes for the first time since sitting down. Really met them. And in that look, Earl saw something he recognized so completely, it was like looking into a mirror that reflected not his face but his history. The look of a child who has become fluent in the language of a dangerous household, who knows the schedule of anger and the geography of safe spaces and the precise sound of a particular man's footsteps and what each variation in those footsteps means. Yes, sir, Earl gave that the space it deserved. Around them, the diner hummed with its ordinary sounds, the distant clatter of the kitchen, the low murmur of conversation at the counter, the waitress folding napkins. Normal sounds, the kind that Wyatt probably hadn't heard much of lately. The kind that belonged to places where people sit and eat and talk and leave without anyone being afraid. What does he do? Earl said carefully when he gets angry. Wyatt looked at the window. He pulled his sleeve down on his left wrist without seeming to realize he'd done it. The gesture was automatic, practice, the kind of movement that becomes muscle memory, when hiding something is more routine than showing it. Earl saw the gesture and cataloged it and kept his face neutral because showing a reaction would have caused the boy to close up, and closing up was the last thing this boy needed to do. He gets loud, Wyatt said, and then he gets quiet. He paused. The quiet is worse. Earl nodded. He didn't push further. He'd heard enough. He'd heard more than enough. He'd heard versions of this conversation in different voices, in different diners, across 30 years, in 24 states. And it never got easier to listen to, and it never should. But this time something else was pulling at him. A thread he couldn't see but could feel connecting this boy to a hallway he hadn't thought about in decades. A hallway in a house in Kentucky where an 11-year-old version of himself had stood outside a neighbor's door at 2 in the morning with his shoes untied and his nose bleeding, and knocked and knocked and knocked, and no one had opened the door. No one had opened the door. That hallway had been in Earl's chest for 47 years. He had buried it under leather and distance and the sound of engines and the particular kind of silence that a man wraps around a wound when he has decided that healing is less important than functioning. But it was there. It had always been there. And right now, sitting in a booth in a diner in Ohio across from a 10-year-old boy with a bruise on his jaw and a brother still in the house, that hallway was as real and as present as the coffee growing cold in the mug he'd forgotten he was holding. He looked at Boone, who gave a small nod, then at Sawyer, who was already reaching for his phone under the table. Wyatt, Earl said, we're going to help you, but I need you to tell me a few things first. Can you do that? The boy looked at him for a long moment. He was weighing something. The same calculation as before, but different this time. Less about exits, more about whether this particular stranger was the kind who meant what he said. And somewhere in the process of that calculation, something shifted in Wyatt's face. Not trust, not yet, because trust was something that had been broken too many times to repair in a single moment. But the possibility of trust, the crack in the wall through which trust might eventually find its way. Okay, Wyatt said quietly. Does Rick have a black pickup? It's in the driveway. Does he go out in the mornings? Sometimes, not usually. Is there anyone else in the house besides Rick, your mom and your brother? No. Earl leaned back. He studied the boy's face, the bruise, the careful eyes, the way he sat compact and alert, ready to move. Everything about this child was calibrated for survival. Every posture and every word and every glance at the parking lot, and Earl thought that no 10-year-old should have to be this good at staying alive. Okay, here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay right here with me. Sawyer's going to make a call, and nobody's going to that police station on foot in the cold. Wyatt looked at Sawyer, then back at Earl. You're going to call the police. Sawyer's going to find out what the right move is, Earl said. There's a difference. That seemed to land. Wyatt nodded once slowly and picked up his mug again. This time he drank, a long, slow sip that was less about thirst and more about the simple physical act of receiving something warm. Sawyer had already stepped away from the table, phone to his ear, voice low. The measured tone of a man who had made difficult phone calls before and understood that the first 30 seconds determined how the rest went. He stood near the entrance where the reception was better, one hand in his pocket, his eyes still scanning the parking lot through the glass door even while he talked. Boone pulled out his own phone and was searching something. The address on Sycamore most likely, or the non-emergency line for the county, or both. Boone was the kind of man who gathered information the way other men gathered tools, quietly and thoroughly, building a picture of the situation before deciding how to act within it. Earl watched Wyatt watch the parking lot and said nothing more for a moment. The waitress came by and refilled the hot chocolate without being asked. Wyatt looked up at her, surprised by the small kindness, the casual ease of it, and she gave him a quick smile and moved on. He stared at the full mug for a second, as though he wasn't quite sure what to do with someone being that effortless about caring. As though kindness without conditions was a language he had once spoken and had since forgotten, and hearing it again, even in the small grammar of a refilled mug, was enough to make something behind his eyes go briefly unsteady. Sawyer came back. He sat down and leaned toward Earl. His face was neutral, but his eyes held something hard. Dispatch says there's been a prior call from that address 8 months ago. Report filed. No charges. The words landed in Earl's chest like stones dropping into still water. Report filed. No charges. He knew what that meant. Everyone at this table knew what that meant. It meant someone had asked for help, and the help had arrived, and then the help had left, and nothing had changed except that the asking had been punished. Unit available. 15, maybe 20 minutes. They've got something on the other side of the county. Earl looked at Wyatt. The boy was pretending not to listen, but his hands had gone still around the mug, and his eyes had fixed on a point on the table that wasn't there, the unfocused stare of someone processing information that confirmed what they already feared. "What's your brother's name?" Earl asked. "Levi." "Is Levi scared right now?" Wyatt set the mug down. His voice, when he answered, was very controlled. The control of a child who has practiced holding himself together so many times that it has become structural. Load-bearing, the kind you can't remove without the whole thing coming down. Levi's always scared. He just doesn't show it because he thinks he has to be brave for Mom. Earl felt the thread pull tighter. The hallway in Kentucky, the door that didn't open, the 11-year-old standing in the dark with his shoes untied. But that boy had eventually found his own road. And the man he'd become was sitting in this booth now, with a cup of cold coffee and 2 friends who would follow him into a burning building if he asked, and a 10-year-old kid who had walked a mile in the cold because every single adult in his life had failed him, and he had decided to save his family himself. Earl stood up. He put 2 20s on the table without counting them, and looked at Boone and Sawyer. "Let's go." Wyatt looked up sharply. "We're Sycamore Street." Earl pulled on his jacket. "You're going to sit behind me and hold on, and we're going to go get your brother." The boy stared at him. Something shifted in his face. Not quite relief, not yet, because relief requires believing the danger is over, and Wyatt was smart enough to know it wasn't. But something loosened. Something that had been locked down tight since he'd walked out that door in the dark, early hours of the morning. A small thing barely visible, like a bolt being turned a quarter inch. Not open yet, but no longer frozen shut. He slid out of the booth and stood up. "Okay," he said. The motorcycles filled the parking lot with sound for exactly 3 seconds, then settled into the low, steady rumble of machines idling in cold air. Wyatt climbed on behind Earl and gripped the sides of the seat with both hands. Not the jacket. The seat. Earl noticed the careful distance the boy maintained, even in a moment that required holding on the precise calibration of a child who had learned that touching another person's body was something that required permission and caution and a calculation of potential consequences. He said nothing about it. He just pulled out of the lot and turned east toward Route 12 and then south, and the morning opened up around them. The road was flat and gray and empty. The fields on either side had been harvested, and what remained was stubble and dirt and the occasional fence post standing solitary against the sky. The air was cold and sharp, and it smelled like the particular scent of late October in Ohio, the scent of things ending and things waiting, and the thin edge of winter pressing in from the north. Wyatt didn't speak during the ride. He sat rigid behind Earl with his hands on the seat and his face turned slightly to the right away from the wind, and Earl could feel the tension in the boy's body the way you feel a guitar string that's been wound too tight. One more turn and it would snap. But it hadn't snapped yet, and Earl thought that was probably the most remarkable thing about this kid. Not his courage, though there was courage. Not his composure, though there was that too. But his endurance. The sheer, stubborn refusal to break. They turned onto Sycamore Street 4 minutes after leaving the diner. The street was residential, the kind that had probably looked decent 20 years ago, and had since settled into a tired kind of ordinary. Chain link fences. Cars parked half on the curb, a basketball hoop with no net rusting at the end of one driveway. The trees lining the street were completely bare, their branches flat and gray against the heavy sky. Late afternoon light was already fading, despite the early hour, the overcast pulling everything toward a premature dusk. Earl pulled up half a block short of the address Wyatt had given him. Boone and Sawyer stopped behind him. The three engines cut out and the street was suddenly very quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that sits on a place like a weight pressing everything down. "Which one?" Earl asked. Wyatt pointed. "A single-story house. White siding gone dingy, the color of a shirt that's been washed too many times with the wrong detergent. A concrete porch with a plastic chair on it, the kind sold at hardware stores for $4. A window with a curtain drawn across it. The driveway was empty." "The truck's gone," Wyatt said. His voice changed when he said it. Not louder, not softer, but different. The way a voice changes when the equation it's been solving suddenly gains a new variable. "Could be anywhere," Earl said. "He went looking for me." Wyatt said it with certainty. "He woke up and I was gone and he went looking." Earl absorbed that. He looked at the house. The curtain didn't move. A light was on somewhere inside, visible as a warm yellow glow through the fabric. A glow that looked wrong against the gray siding and the bare trees and the heavy sky, the way warmth looks wrong when you know what's generating it. "Your mom and brother are still in there. Mom won't leave while he's got the truck. She doesn't have a car, and he might have locked the doors. He does that sometimes. Locks it from outside so Mom can't go anywhere." Earl looked at him. "He locks your mother in the house." It wasn't a question. Wyatt understood that. Not always, just when he's angry, or when he thinks she might try something. Earl filed that away in the place where he kept things that would be useful later. He swung his leg off the bike and looked at Boone. "Go around back. Check the yard, the doors. Don't go in." Boone nodded and walked his bike forward, slowly rolling it by hand around the corner without starting the engine. The silence felt deliberate, as though the street itself understood that what was happening here required a different kind of approach. Sawyer stayed where he was positioned, so he could see both the front of the house and the road in either direction. He sat on his bike with the engine off and his hands resting on his knees, and his eyes moving steadily, the unhurried surveillance of a man who had learned patience in places where impatience got people hurt. "Stay here with Sawyer," Earl told Wyatt. "I want to come." "I know. Stay here." Wyatt looked at the house. His right hand had found the edge of his sleeve and was holding it, the same unconscious gesture from the diner, the same protective reflex that Earl had seen too many times on too many children to pretend it meant anything other than what it meant. Earl turned and walked up the cracked concrete path to the front porch. He didn't hurry. He'd learned a long time ago that how you approached a door told the people inside more than any words would. A man who hurries is a man who wants something. A man who doesn't hurry is a man who already has what he needs and is simply arriving. He knocked 3 times, firm, not aggressive, and stepped back 1 pace. Silence inside. Then movement. Footsteps that stopped, then started again, hesitant. The particular pattern of someone who had heard a knock and was deciding whether to answer it, which was really the decision of whether the person on the other side was more dangerous to face or more dangerous to ignore. A curtain moved in the window. Earl saw a face behind it, partially obscured. Dark hair, pale skin, eyes that moved quickly across him and then to the street. The face disappeared. A lock clicked. The door opened 4 inches, held by a chain. The woman on the other side was somewhere in her mid-30s, though she looked older in the way that a particular kind of exhaustion ages people. Not the exhaustion of hard work, the exhaustion of sustained vigilance. The tiredness of a person who has not truly relaxed in so long that her body has forgotten the shape of it. Dark hair pulled back, shadows under her eyes that were not from one sleepless night, but from 100. She looked at Earl. at the jacket, the beard, the size of him, and her expression moved through several things very quickly before settling on a careful neutrality that Jolene had practiced until it was automatic. "Can I help you?" "My name's Earl," he said. "I met your son at the diner up on Route 12. Wyatt, he's safe. He's down the street with my friend." Jolene's eyes went to the street. They found Wyatt immediately standing beside Sawyer's motorcycle, small and still, against the gray backdrop of the houses across the road. And something passed through her face that she immediately pulled back in. A crack in the neutrality, a flash of something that might have been relief or terror or both, because for a woman in Jolene's position, the two were often indistinguishable. Her hand tightened on the door. "He shouldn't have," she said. Then she stopped. The sentence had a second half that she chose not to finish, and the silence where the rest of the words should have been was louder than anything she could have said. "Ma'am," Earl said quietly, "I just need to know that the boy inside is okay." "Levi." She flinched at the name. Not dramatically. Just a small contraction around the eyes. The involuntary response of a person whose child's name has been spoken by a stranger and who has spent enough time in fear to know that strangers speaking your children's names is rarely the beginning of something good. "Levi's fine," she said. "He's sleeping." "I'd like to see him." "I don't," she started. "I can't just—" She stopped again. She was looking past Earl at the street, at Wyatt, at the empty driveway where the black pickup should have been and wasn't. "He's not here," she said. It was unclear whether she meant this as reassurance or warning. "I know," Earl said. "Your son told me he went looking for Wyatt. He'll come back." "I know that too." They looked at each other through the 4-inch gap. And Earl saw in her face the particular trapped look of a person who is standing inside a cage and can see the door is open, but cannot make herself walk through it, because the cage has taught her that doors that look open are sometimes the most dangerous kind. "Can you take the chain off?" Earl asked. She didn't answer for a moment. Then she looked at the street one more time, at Wyatt, at the empty driveway, at the heavy autumn sky. "My door's locked from outside," she said. "The deadbolt. Rick took the key." Earl was quiet for 1 second. "2. The chain's on from the inside." "The chain, yes, but the deadbolt I can't. He locked it when he left." She paused. "The back door, too." Earl absorbed this. A woman locked inside her own house by a man who had left to go hunt for a 10-year-old boy. He turned and made a small gesture toward the side of the house. A moment later, Boone appeared at the corner. "Back door's locked, too," Boone said quietly. "Deadbolt. But the lock's old. I can pop it." Earl looked at Jolene through the gap. "Ma'am, we can open the back door. Bring you and Levi out. Police are on their way. You don't have to go back in that house tonight." Jolene's hand was white on the door. Her knuckles stood out like stones underwater. She looked at the street, at her son, at the man on her porch who she had never met, and who was offering her the things she had imagined 1,000 times in the dark, lying in bed next to Rick, listening to his breathing, counting the hours until morning. "He'll come back," she said again. "Yes," Earl said, "he will. And when he does, there'll be police here, and us, and you'll be outside with your boys, and that'll be the start of something different." Jolene closed her eyes. She stood behind the door with her eyes closed and her hand on the chain, and she breathed. Earl watched her breathe, and he didn't rush her, and he didn't repeat himself, and he didn't do any of the things that people do when they want someone to hurry up and decide. He just stood on the porch in the cold October air and let her have the time, because he understood that what she was doing right now was not hesitating. She was gathering. The way a person gathers themselves before stepping off a ledge, not because they're uncertain about the fall, but because they want to be fully present for the moment they stop standing still. She opened her eyes. "Okay," she said. "Get us out." Earl nodded once. He stepped off the porch and walked around the side of the house to where Boone was standing by the back door. The yard was small and flat and tired, the kind of yard that existed not because someone wanted it, but because the house came with one. A rusted grill sat in the corner. A plastic bucket lay on its side near the fence. The tree in the center had lost all its leaves and stood bare and patient, as if it had been waiting for something for a very long time and had made its peace with the possibility that it might never arrive. "How old is the lock?" Earl asked. 20 years, maybe more. Standard deadbolt, pin tumbler. I've seen worse on shed doors." Do it. Boone knelt by the back door. He pulled a small kit from his jacket pocket, the kind of kit that men in certain professions carry without discussing it, and he worked the lock with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood mechanical things the way other people understood language. The pins gave way in under a minute. The deadbolt turned. The door swung inward. The kitchen was small and dim, yellow linoleum floor curling at the edges. A table with 3 chairs, though there were 4 people living in this house. The absence of the 4th chair said something that Jolene had probably stopped noticing and that Earl noticed immediately. A coffee mug sat on the counter half full and still warm. Rick's mug. The evidence of his recent presence sat there like a signature, casual and proprietary, the mark of a man who had no doubt that he would be back to finish what he'd started. Jolene appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had Levi in her arms. The boy was awake now, his face pressed into his mother's neck, his arms around her with the tight grip of a child who has been told to hold on and is doing exactly that. He was wearing pajamas with small rockets on them, the kind of pajamas that belong to a life where bedtime is safe and morning is something to look forward to. He looked at Earl with witty, still eyes. Not frightened, not yet. Something before fright. The cautious alertness of a small animal that has sensed a change in the air, but hasn't yet determined what kind of change it is. It's okay, Jolene said to him. She said it the way she probably said it every day, multiple times a day. A phrase that had long since lost its connection to truth and had become instead a kind of incantation repeated not because it was accurate, but because the alternative was to say nothing, and nothing was worse. My brother, Levi said. His voice was small and clear, the voice of a child who has one question and needs it answered before anything else in the world can proceed. He's outside. We're going to see him right now. Earl stepped back to give them room. Jolene carried Levi through the kitchen and out the back door and into the yard. The cold air hit them immediately, and Levi pressed closer to his mother, and Jolene held him tighter, the instinctive mutual sheltering of 2 people who had been each other's warmth for longer than either of them could articulate. Boone walked ahead, checking the side of the house, the gap between the fence and the wall, the line of sight from the street. Then he signaled, and Jolene followed him around to the front. Wyatt saw them before they saw him. He had been standing beside Sawyer's motorcycle with his hands in the pockets of his blue hoodie and his eyes on the house, and when his mother appeared at the corner with Levi in her arms, something happened in his face that was too large for his features to contain. It moved through him like weather. Not joy, not relief. Something more fundamental. The confirmation that the people he loved were still alive and still moving toward him. He walked. Then he ran. He ran the way children run when they have forgotten for a moment that running is something they have learned to be careful about. He reached Jolene, and she knelt with Levi still in one arm and pulled Wyatt to her with the other. The 3 of them stayed like that on the cracked sidewalk of Sycamore Street, knotted together, a small tight knot of 3 people who had been in the same house and different prisons and were now for the first time in longer than any of them could remember in the same place in every sense of the word. Earl stood on the sidewalk and watched and said nothing. Boone and Sawyer stood behind him and said nothing. There was nothing to say. There are moments in the world that are so purely what they are that language would only diminish them, and this was one of those moments. Levi lifted his face from Jolene's shoulder. He looked at Wyatt with the particular intensity of a 7-year-old who has been told to be brave and has been brave and is now ready to stop being brave and let someone else take over. You left, Levi said, not accusation, observation. The simple statement of a fact by a child who deals in facts because facts are more reliable than promises. I came back, Wyatt said. Levi considered this. Then he put his head back on his mother's shoulder, apparently satisfied with the mathematics of departure and return. Jolene stood. She held Levi on her hip and kept one hand on Wyatt's shoulder, and she looked at Earl. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying. She was holding that too, the way she held everything tightly and silently, and with the particular discipline of a woman who had learned that tears in the wrong moment could cost more than she could afford. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Earl said. We need to get you away from this house before he comes back. Jolene nodded. She looked at the empty driveway, at the house with its dingy siding and its curtained windows, and its single plastic chair on the porch. She looked at it the way you look at something you are seeing for the first time from the outside, The way a prisoner looks at a cell after the door has been opened, recognizing with a shock that the room is smaller than it seemed from inside, that the walls are closer, that the space you lived in was never as large as the fear that filled it. She turned away from the house. "Where do we go?" she asked. Before Earl could answer, Sawyer spoke from behind them. His voice was even, but the undertone carried something that made everyone turn. "Earl." Earl looked at him. Sawyer was facing down the street. His posture hadn't changed. His hands were still on his knees. But his eyes had narrowed and his chin had lifted slightly, the way a man's chin lifts when he is looking at something in the distance that is getting closer. Earl followed his gaze. At the far end of Sycamore Street, where the road curved toward Route 12, a black pickup truck had turned the corner. It was moving slowly. Not the slow of a man who was unsure of his destination. The slow of a man who had found what he was looking for. The truck came down the street with the patient, deliberate approach of something that had all the time in the world and knew it. The engine was a low rumble, barely audible at this distance, but growing the way a storm grows, not suddenly but steadily, filling the space it enters until there is room for nothing else. Wyatt saw it. His hand found his mother's arm and gripped. "That's him," he said. Jolene went still. Every muscle in her body locked at once, the total freeze response of a body that has been conditioned to stop moving when it senses the predator's return. She held Levi tighter, and Levi felt the change in her, and his fingers curled into the fabric of her shirt. And he made no sound at all because he had learned at 7 that silence was the safest shape a person could take. Earl watched the truck approach. He did not move. He did not reach for anything. He stood on the sidewalk of Sycamore Street with his hands at his sides and his feet set and his eyes steady, and he waited for the black pickup to get close enough for the driver to see what was waiting for him. The truck slowed, then stopped, 30 yards away. Through the windshield, Earl could see Rick's face. The calculation, the assessment, 3 motorcycles, 3 men, his family on the sidewalk, his empty driveway. The geometry of a situation that had changed while he was gone, rearranged by forces he had not anticipated and could not immediately control. The truck sat there, engine running, exhaust curling white in the cold air. Earl stood there, engine off breath, curling white in the same cold air. And between them, on the cracked sidewalk in front of a house that had held too much silence for too many years, Jolene held her sons and waited for the next thing to happen. The black pickup rolled forward, slowly. The engine note dropped as Rick took his foot off the gas and let the truck coast the way a man coasts when he wants the people in front of him to have time to see him coming. Time to feel the weight of his approach. Time to remember what his presence meant. He pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. The truck sat there ticking in the cold air, the metal cooling the exhaust, dissipating into a thin white trail that rose and vanished against the gray sky. The driver's side door opened and Rick stepped out. He was wearing a canvas work jacket over a flannel shirt. His boots were heavy steel-toed, the kind that men who worked with their hands wore because the world they moved through had sharp edges and heavy things that fell. But Rick hadn't worked with his hands in over a year. He wore the boots because they made a sound on hard floors that preceded him into every room he entered, and that sound had become a language that everyone in the house on Sycamore Street understood fluently. He stood beside the truck and looked at the scene in front of him. The 3 motorcycles parked along the curb. Sawyer sitting on one of them with the posture of a man who was not going anywhere. Boone standing at the edge of the driveway with his arms loose at his sides. Earl on the sidewalk, positioned between the truck and Jolene and the boys. And Jolene herself holding Levi on her hip, one hand on Wyatt's shoulder, standing exactly where she had been standing when the truck turned the corner. Rick's eyes moved across all of this. He did not rush. He cataloged each element with the systematic attention of a man who had spent his life assessing situations, measuring threats, determining which pieces of any given moment could be controlled and which could not. His eyes settled on Jolene. "Get in the house," he said, his voice carried without him raising it. That was one of Rick's particular skills. He had a voice that traveled. It didn't need volume. It had gravity, the kind of gravity that pulled things toward it, whether they wanted to move or not. Jolene didn't move. Levi turned his face into her neck. Wyatt's hand found hers and held it. Rick looked at Earl. His expression had settled into something flat and careful, the public face of a man who understood that there were witnesses and that witnesses changed the arithmetic of what was permissible. "Who are you?" Rick said. "Just a man who met your boy up the road," Earl said. He kept his voice even. Not friendly, not hostile, level. The voice of someone who has no interest in escalation but no fear of it either. Wanted to make sure he got home safe. "He's home now. You can go." "I will, in a minute." Rick's jaw tightened. A small movement, almost invisible. But Earl had been reading faces for 40 years, and he caught it the way a fisherman catches a ripple on still water. "There's no minute," Rick said. "This is my property, my family. You got no business here." "Probably not," Earl agreed. He didn't move from the sidewalk. He didn't shift his weight or cross his arms or do any of the things that signal a man preparing for confrontation. He simply stood there patient as stone, as if he had nowhere else to be and nothing else he'd rather be doing. Rick took a step forward, not toward Earl, toward Jolene. "Jolene," she flinched. The name in his mouth was not the same name she carried inside herself. In his mouth it was a command, a leash, a sound that meant return to where you belong. She had been hearing her own name that way for 2 years, and the reflex was so deep that her body responded before her mind could intervene. Her shoulders drew in, her chin dropped. She made herself smaller. But she did not move toward him. It was a small thing, the smallest possible form of defiance. She did not step forward. She did not take Levi and Wyatt back up that path and through that door and into the yellow kitchen with its 3 chairs and its half-finished coffee. She just stayed where she was. Still. Frozen perhaps, but frozen in place, which was different from frozen in retreat. Rick saw it, the failure of the command to produce the expected result. And something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation rapid and invisible, the adjustment of a man who has pulled a lever that has always worked and found, for the first time, that it hasn't moved anything. He looked at Wyatt. The boy was standing beside his mother with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on Rick, and his hand holding Jolene's with a grip that was probably painful for both of them. There was no fear in Wyatt's face. There was something older than fear. Something that had passed through fear and come out the other side and was now standing in a place that had no name, but looked a great deal like resolve. "Wyatt," Rick said. His voice changed slightly when he said the boy's name. Softer. The manufactured softness of a man who understood that children were sometimes more easily controlled than adults, and that the control of a child could be used as leverage against a mother. "Come here, son." Wyatt didn't move. "I said come here." "He's fine where he is," Earl said. Rick turned to him. The flat expression cracked for just a moment, and what was underneath was not anger, not exactly, but something more dangerous. The cold, compressed fury of a man whose authority has been challenged in his own territory. "You need to leave," Rick said. Right now, before I call the police myself." "Police are already on their way," Earl said. "Prior report on this address. They're going to want to talk to you." The words landed differently than anything else that had been said. Rick's face didn't change, not in the way that most faces change when they receive unexpected information. Instead, it went still, completely still. The stillness of a man who is doing arithmetic very quickly and not liking the numbers. He looked at Jolene. "What did you do?" "She didn't do anything," Earl said. "Your boy walked to a diner on Route 12 and asked for help. That's what happened. No one in this situation did anything except a 10-year-old kid who decided he'd had enough." Rick's eyes stayed on Jolene. He hadn't looked at Earl when Earl spoke. He was looking at Jolene the way a man looks at something he owns that has malfunctioned, not with surprise, with the particular displeasure of someone who will need to fix something later when there are fewer people watching. Jolene saw the look. She knew what it meant. She had received that look 100 times, and every time it was followed by the same sequence: the closing of doors, the lowering of voices, the careful, calibrated pressure that left marks only where they couldn't be seen. But this time, standing on the sidewalk with her boys and 3 strangers who had positioned themselves like walls between her and the man in the driveway, Jolene felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not courage, not yet. Something that came before courage. The faint, barely perceptible recognition that there existed right now in this exact moment, a space between herself and Rick that had not been there before. A gap, an opening, small enough to close with one step, but present. She looked at her sons, Wyatt standing rigid holding her hand, Levi, his face against her neck, his fingers curled into her shirt. Two boys who had been learning every day for 2 years the architecture of fear. Who had been building their understanding of the world around the shape of what Rick allowed and what Rick punished, and who had begun without knowing it to accept that architecture as permanent, as the way things were. And then Rick changed tactics. It happened the way weather changes on a plane. One moment the pressure was building hard and static and compressed, and the next moment it shifted direction entirely. Rick's shoulders dropped. His hands came out of his jacket pockets and hung at his sides, open palms visible. His face softened. Not dramatically, just enough. The precise amount of softening that a particular kind of man learns to produce when he senses that force is not going to work and that the situation requires a different tool. "Jolene," he said, and this time the name was different. This time it was the name she had heard in the early days. The name that had sounded like shelter when she was drowning. The name that had been attached to grocery bags and a fixed faucet and a man who sat with her when she couldn't sleep in the months after Marcus died. "Baby, come on, you know me. You know us, these people." He gestured at Earl at Boone at Sawyer, a small dismissive movement of one hand. "They don't know what our family is. They don't know what we've been through." He took a half step closer. Not aggressive, careful. The step of a man approaching something fragile. "Remember what it was like after Marcus died? Remember how I was the one who showed up? I was there, Jolene, when no one else was. I brought groceries. I fixed the bathroom sink. I sat with you when you couldn't sleep." His voice had dropped into the register that Jolene knew best. The low, warm register that had convinced her 2 years ago that this man was safe. That this man was the answer to the question that Marcus's death had left behind. The question of who would be there, who would help, who would fill the space. "We had a rough patch," Rick said. "I know that. I know I need to do better. But these strangers on our street cops coming to our house, this isn't how we fix things. This is how things get worse. You know that." He was looking at Jolene with an expression of such convincing sincerity that a stranger watching might have believed him, might have thought, here is a man trying to save his family. Here is a man who loves this woman and has made mistakes and wants another chance. Jolene felt it. She felt the pull of it, the particular gravitational force of a narrative she had been telling herself for 2 years. The narrative that said, he's not always like this. That said there were good days. That said Levi laughed at dinner last Tuesday, and Rick was the one who made him laugh. She felt herself leaning toward it the way a person leans toward warmth in the cold. Not with her body, with something deeper. The part of her that was exhausted and terrified and wanted more than anything for this to be simple. For Rick to be the man he was pretending to be right now. For the good days to be the real days and the bad days to be the aberration. Earl watched this happen from the sidewalk, and he said nothing. Because he understood in the way that only a person who has watched this particular drama play out many times can understand that this was not his moment. This was Jolene's. And the choice she was about to make could not be made for her by a stranger on a motorcycle, no matter how good his intentions. Boone shifted his weight slightly. Sawyer's eyes moved between Rick and Jolene. The street was quiet. A curtain moved in a window 2 houses down and then was still. "Come inside," Rick said. "We'll talk, just us. No strangers, no police." Jolene's mouth opened. No sound came out. She was standing on the edge of something, and she could feel it, the tipping point, the precise moment where the next word she spoke would determine the direction of everything that followed. One word toward Rick, and the architecture would rebuild itself around her. One word away from him, and the architecture would collapse, and she would have to build something new from whatever was left. And she did not know if there was enough left to build anything at all. Wyatt felt his mother's hand tremble in his. He looked up at her face and saw what was happening there, the war between the person she was and the person Rick had spent 2 years teaching her to be, and he felt something rise in his chest that was not anger and not fear, but something more elemental than both. He spoke. "Mom." Jolene looked down at him. "I don't want Levi to grow up scared like me." The words were quiet, measured. The words of a 10-year-old who had spent months choosing them and had waited until this exact moment to say them because he understood with the terrible wisdom of a child who has been forced to think like an adult that this was the moment when they would matter most. The effect was immediate, not dramatic. There was no gasp, no cry, no sudden movement. Jolene simply looked at her son, and her face did something that no one on that street would ever forget. It broke. Not the way glass breaks sudden and sharp, the way ice breaks in spring. Slowly from beneath, from the place where warmth has been building for a long time without anyone noticing. The surface cracks and the water underneath begins to move, and what was frozen begins to flow. She looked at Wyatt, she looked at Levi, she looked at Rick, and then she took one step backward, away from him, toward the street, toward the motorcycles and the strangers in the cold October air and everything that was uncertain and terrifying and unknown. One step. Rick saw it. The step. The direction. The meaning. His face changed. The manufactured softness disappeared as if someone had wiped it away with a cloth, and what was underneath was the thing that Jolene and Wyatt and Levi had lived with for 2 years. The real face. The one that emerged when the door was closed and the audience was gone, and the only people watching were the ones who couldn't leave. He took a step forward. Hard. Fast. Earl moved, not toward Rick, into the space between Rick and Jolene. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't speak. He just had occupied the space the way Apollo occupies space by being there and being immovable. Rick stopped. His chest was rising and falling faster now. His hands had closed into fists at his sides, and the tendons in his neck stood out like cables. "Get out of my way," he said. "No," Earl said. "Oh, Earl." Boone had moved to the edge of the driveway, blocking the path between the truck and the sidewalk. Sawyer had stepped off his motorcycle and was standing 10 feet away, with his phone in his hand, visible recording. Rick saw the phone. His eyes locked on it, and his jaw worked, and the calculation happened again, faster this time, more desperate. "You're trespassing," he said. "All of you. This is my property." "Sidewalk's public," Earl said. A sound reached them from the distance, faint but unmistakable. The two-tone pattern of a siren, far away but getting closer, coming from the direction of Route 9, cutting through the still autumn air, with the particular urgency that sirens carry even when they're not moving fast. Rick heard it. Everyone heard it. Something went out of Rick's posture, not all of it. Not the anger, not the compressed fury, not the fundamental orientation of a man who believed the world owed him obedience, but the energy behind it, the forward lean, the readiness for physical action. It drained out of him the way water drains from a container when you tip it slowly, not all at once, but in a steady diminishing that left behind something hollow and still. He looked at Jolene one last time, and the look he gave her was not the look of a man who was letting go. It was the look of a man who was filing something away for later. A promise that didn't need words because the promise had been made 100 times before in the language of closed doors and lowered voices and marks left where they couldn't be seen. "You'll come back," he said, quietly, just to her, just loud enough for her to hear. "You always do." Jolene heard it, and the words hit her the way certain words do not, because they are cruel, but because they are true, because she had come back, every time. After every incident, after every report that went nowhere, after every morning when she woke up and thought, "Today I will leave," and then the day passed and she was still there, and the next morning came, and the thought repeated, and the cycle continued. She had always come back, but Wyatt was holding her hand, and Levi was holding her neck. And for the first time in 2 years, the weight on her left side and the weight on her right side were not the weight of obligation or guilt, or the terrible arithmetic of a mother who believes she is failing. They were the weight of two small people who needed her to take one more step. She took it. The police cruiser came around the corner of Sycamore Street at exactly the moment that Jolene's second step landed. It rolled in without sirens, now headlights cutting through the gray dusk, and pulled up behind the motorcycles with a quiet that felt deliberate, measured. The kind of arrival that says, "We have been here before, and we know how this goes." Two officers stepped out, a woman in her 30s, her hair pulled back her belt, heavy with equipment that clinked softly as she moved. A man, a few years older, heavier, with the weathered face of someone who had spent a career looking at things he wished he hadn't seen, and going home at night to a family that could never quite understand what he carried with him. The female officer scanned the scene quickly. Two boys standing with their mother on the sidewalk. Three bikers positioned around the property. A man standing in the driveway beside a black pickup, a closed front door behind him. A street going dark as the afternoon faded toward evening. She walked to Earl first. "You the one who called?" "My man did," Earl said. He kept his voice low, factual. "Prior report on this address, 8 months ago." She nodded. She'd already known. She'd pulled the file before leaving the station the way good officers do when they recognize an address and want to know exactly what they're driving into. "Anyone inside?" "Empty now, mother and both boys are here. Man's name is Rick. That's him in the driveway." She looked at Rick, then at Jolene, then at Wyatt, who was standing beside his mother with his jaw set and his eyes steady and his hand still holding hers. She turned to her partner and they exchanged a look. The look carried the weight of everything they both understood about situations like this one. Everything that training could teach and experience could verify, and neither could fully prepare you for. Then she walked toward the house, and he moved to flank the driveway, positioning himself between Rick and the truck. "Sir," the male officer said to Rick, "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them." Rick looked at the officer, then at Earl, then at Jolene. The calculation was still running behind his eyes, but the variables had changed. The situation had moved past the point where charm could redirect it or intimidation could contain it. There were badges and body cameras in a report from 8 months ago that had been insufficient then, but might not be insufficient now. He stepped away from the truck. He kept his hands visible. He sat down in the plastic chair on the porch when the officer gestured toward it, and he sat with the controlled stillness of a man who had decided that cooperation was currently his best option, which was not the same thing as cooperation, and everyone present understood the difference. The female officer approached Jolene. She stopped a few feet away, and her voice when she spoke was different from the voice she'd used with Earl. Softer, more careful. The voice of someone who understood that the woman in front of her was in a state of fear that could not be dispelled by the presence of a badge, and that trust in situations like this was something that had to be earned in increments. "Ma'am, my name is Officer Patterson. Can you tell me your name?" Jolene looked at her. She was still holding Levi, still holding Wyatt's hand. She had not let go of either since stepping away from Rick. "Jolene," she said. "Jolene, are you hurt?" "No." "Are your boys hurt?" Jolene looked at Wyatt, at the bruise on his jaw, at the wrist he kept covered with his sleeve, at the 7-year-old in her arms who had not spoken since his brother's name and who was watching everything with eyes that were too old for his face. "Yes," she said. The word came out like something that had been trapped for a very long time and was finding the shape of its own release. Officer Patterson wrote something down. "Would you be willing to come to the station and give a statement?" "Yes." "Both boys too?" "Yes." "Is there anything in the house you need right now? Medications, documents, anything for the children?" Jolene looked at the house. The dingy siding, the curtained windows, the porch where Rick sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes following every word she said. "No," she said. "There's nothing in there I need." The officer nodded. She turned and walked to her partner and spoke quietly for a moment. The partner spoke into his radio. The sound of it, the crackle and the coded language, and the dispatcher's voice coming back steady and routine filled the street with the particular noise of systems engaging. Machinery beginning to move. The slow, imperfect, sometimes inadequate, but present machinery of people whose job it was to stand between the vulnerable and the violent. A second cruiser arrived. The street got a little brighter with the added headlights. A neighbor appeared on a porch 2 houses down. A heavy man in a bathrobe watched for a while with the particular attention of someone who had suspected something and was now watching it be confirmed, and then went back inside. Sawyer had disappeared toward Route 12 without anyone asking him to. He returned 15 minutes later with 2 hot chocolates from the diner in a paper bag that turned out to contain a grilled cheese sandwich cut in half. He handed 1 hot chocolate to Wyatt and 1 to Jolene and gave the sandwich to Levi, who accepted it with both hands and ate it with the focused attention of a child who was very hungry and had decided that this was the most important thing happening right now. Wyatt gave his statement to Officer Patterson standing near the hood of her cruiser. Quiet, precise, no dramatics. The same careful composure he'd carried all afternoon, all year, all the time since Rick had moved into the house on Sycamore, and the architecture of fire had begun to be built 1 brick at a time around the family that Wyatt had been trying to protect, with the only tools a 10-year-old had available: vigilant silence and the willingness to walk 4 miles in the cold. Earl listened from a distance and thought that the boy had probably been preparing that statement in his head for longer than today, probably for months. Lying in his bed at night in a house where the quiet was worse than the loud, rehearsing the words he would say when someone finally asked. Rick was walked to the second cruiser by 2 officers. He went without resistance. He went the way a certain kind of man goes when he is outnumbered and outmaneuvered and has decided that the performance of compliance is his last available tool. His face was calm, his steps were measured, and just before he reached the cruiser, he turned and looked at Jolene across the 30 feet of cracked concrete and dying grass that separated them. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The look said everything that his voice would have said if there hadn't been officers on either side of him and a body camera recording every word. The look said, "This isn't over." The look said, "I know where you are." The look said, "You will come back." Jolene saw the look. She received it in the place behind her sternum, where fear lived, the place that was always slightly constricted, always slightly difficult to breathe around the place that had become so familiar. She sometimes forgot it was there until a moment like this reminded her that it had never left. But she did not look away. She held Rick's gaze across the dying lawn and the cracked sidewalk and the distance between them that was for the first time a distance that she had chosen. She had walked away from him. She had taken those steps, and the fact that her legs were shaking and her heart was beating too fast and her arms were aching from holding Levi for too long did not diminish the truth of those steps. They were hers. She had taken them, and she was still standing on the ground where they had carried her. Rick got into the cruiser. The door closed. The car pulled away from the curb and turned at the corner and was gone. The street went quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes after something leaves when the space where the thing was is still shaped like it still holds the impression, but the thing itself is no longer there. Earl stood beside his motorcycle and looked at the house. The porch was empty now. The plastic chair sat there alone under the flat autumn sky. The light in the front window was still on, warm and yellow, glowing through the curtain, with the particular persistence of a bulb that would stay lit all night because no one would go back inside to turn it off. Jolene sat on the curb with Levi in her lap and Wyatt beside her. Levi had finished the sandwich and was leaning against his mother's chest with the heavy, warm weight of a child who was beginning to believe cautiously that the danger might be passing. Wyatt sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped together and his eyes on the street, still watching, still alert, still carrying the particular vigilance that would take longer to set down than it had taken to pick up. Jolene looked at Earl. He was standing a few feet away, his hands in his jacket pockets, his face angled slightly toward the sky, as if he were checking the weather or asking the clouds a question he already knew the answer to. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you go to the station," Earl said. "Give your statement. There's a family advocate there who'll help figure out next steps." "And then, Mom," Earl looked at her. "That part's up to you." Jolene nodded. She looked at the house one more time. The place where she had lived for 3 years, first with Marcus and the boys, and then after Marcus died alone with the boys, in the silence, in the mortgage, in the creeping fear that she couldn't do this by herself. And then Rick had appeared. Rick with his groceries and his fixed sink, and his steady voice and his hands that had seemed in the beginning like hands that would hold things together. She looked away. "I'm not going back," she said. She said it quietly, the way you say something for the first time when you're not yet sure you believe it, but you need to hear it out loud to find out if it's real. Earl nodded. He didn't tell her she was brave. He didn't tell her she was doing the right thing. He didn't give her any of the words that well-meaning people give in moments like this. Words that are true, but that land on a person who is in the middle of the hardest thing they've ever done, like rain on a coat. Present, but not absorbed. He just nodded. And the nod said, "I hear you," and that's enough for now. Officer Patterson came back. "We're going to transport you and the boys to the station to finish the paperwork. There's a family advocate there who'll help with shelter placement for tonight." Jolene stood up with Levi. Wyatt rose beside her. The three of them stood on the sidewalk in the fading light, a small unit damaged and tired and afraid but standing. All three of them standing. "Ma'am," Officer Patterson said. She paused. She seemed to be weighing whether to say what she was about to say. When we searched the house, we found a room, the second bedroom on the left. The door had a hasp block on the outside. Jolene closed her eyes. We photographed everything. It's going to be part of the file, along with your statement and the boys' statements in the prior report. She paused again. It's enough. This time it's enough. Jolene opened her eyes. She looked at the officer and she didn't say thank you, and she didn't cry. She just nodded once and walked toward the cruiser with her sons. At the car door, she stopped. She turned and looked at Earl one more time. The biker was standing beside his motorcycle with Boone and Sawyer behind him, three men who had no connection to her life and no obligation to be here, and who had come anyway because a 10-year-old boy had walked into a diner and asked for help, and they had answered. Thank you, she said, for coming. Your boy did the hard part, Earl said. We just showed up. Jolene looked at Wyatt. The boy was standing beside her with his hand in hers and his jaw set, and his bruise fading slowly into the colors of healing. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. They got into the cruiser. The door closed. The engine started. And the car pulled away from Sycamore Street, carrying a woman and two boys towards something that was not safety, not yet, because safety is not a place you arrive at, but a thing you build slowly over time with hands that shake and a heart that doubts and the stubborn, unreasonable insistence that tomorrow can be different from today. Earl watched the cruiser's taillights until they turned the corner and disappeared. Then he stood on the empty street and let the quiet settle around him like a coat he'd worn before. Boone came to stand beside him. You good? Boone asked. Earl didn't answer right away. He was looking at the house, at the porch, at the plastic chair where Rick had sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes calculating, always calculating the mathematics of control and leverage, and the particular brand of authority that a man like Rick believed the world owed him. He locked them in, Earl said. Not to Boone exactly, to the street, to the empty driveway, to whatever part of the universe was keeping track. Deadbolted the front door and the back door from the outside and left a woman and a 7-year-old locked inside while he drove around looking for a 10-year-old kid who had the nerve to try to save his own family. Boone said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Room with a lock on the outside, Earl said. She didn't flinch when the officer said it. You know what that means? It means she already knew. She knew it was there because she'd heard it, heard the hasp slide shut, heard her boys on the other side of that door, and she couldn't. He stopped. His jaw worked. His hands, which had been steady all afternoon, steady when Rick stepped out of the truck, steady when the calculation of violence had hung in the air between them like smoke, were not steady now. They trembled at his sides, a fine, rapid tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. Boone waited. Earl took a breath, then another. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes that he'd been carrying for 3 months without opening. He looked at it. He put it back. When I was 11, he said, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, and Boone leaned slightly closer to hear. When I was 11, my old man came home one night and put my mother's head through the drywall next to the kitchen door. I could show you the house. I could show you the wall. The patch they put over it is still there. Different color paint than the rest of the wall. Nobody ever bothered to match it. He paused. I ran out the back door and went to the neighbors, knocked on their door. The Prestons, Ed and Barbara Preston, good people, church every Sunday, brought us casseroles when my mom had her surgery. I knocked on their door at 2 a.m. with blood on my shirt that wasn't mine, and Ed Preston opened the door halfway, looked at me, looked past me at my house and said, Go home, son. This is between your parents. The street was very quiet, and I went home because I was 11 and a grown man told me to, and I didn't know yet that grown men could be wrong about things that mattered. I went home and I went to bed, and the next morning my mother made pancakes with a black eye, and we never talked about it. Not once, not ever. He looked at the house on Sycamore one more time. Nobody opened the door for me, he said. So I open doors now. That's the deal I made with myself. That's the only deal that matters. Boone put a hand on Earl's shoulder. He left it there for a moment, the weight of it, a physical thing, a point of contact between two men who had known each other for 20 years and had shared enough road and enough weather and enough of the particular silence that exists between people who do not need to explain themselves to one another. Then Boone dropped his hand and walked to his motorcycle, and Earl walked to his and Sawyer, who had been sitting on his own bike at the corner, reading a weather report on his phone, looked up at them with the expression of a man who was ready to go when they were ready to go and had no opinion about when that might be. "Station's about 6 miles south," Sawyer said. "We following?" Earl looked at the corner where the cruiser had turned. He thought about Jolene in the back seat with Levi's head on her lap, and Wyatt beside her, riding toward a station, in a statement, in a shelter, in a night that would be the first night of something she hadn't chosen yet, but was being carried toward by the momentum of her own steps. "No," he said, "they've got it from here." But he didn't start his bike. Not yet. "Actually," he said, "let's go to the station. Not to follow, just to wait, in case they need anything." Boone didn't question it. Sawyer didn't question it. They started their bikes and followed Earl south on Route 9, and the sound of the three engines moved through the quiet street and faded, leaving behind the empty house and the bare trees and the single plastic chairs sitting on the porch under the heavy autumn sky. The county sheriff's station sat at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to farmland and the street lights stopped and the dark pressed in from the fields like something patient. It was a low, flat structure built in the 80s with a particular lack of ambition that characterized government buildings in small Ohio towns, functional without being welcoming, lit without being bright, present without being reassuring. Jolene sat in a room on the second floor that had been designed for conversations like this one. The walls were painted a color that was probably meant to be calming, but had aged into something closer to resignation. A table, 4 chairs, a window that looked out onto the parking lot where the snow was accumulating on the hoods of patrol cars in thin, even layers. Levi was asleep. He had fallen asleep in the cruiser, his head on Jolene's lap, his body going heavy and still, in the particular way that children go heavy when they have decided on some deep cellular level that they are safe enough to stop being awake. Jolene had carried him into the station, and a woman with kind eyes and a lanyard that read Family Services had shown them to this room and brought a blanket, and Levi was now sleeping on a couch against the far wall, curled into the blanket with his thumb near his mouth, a habit he'd given up a year ago and had apparently reclaimed. Wyatt sat in the chair beside Jolene. He had not fallen asleep. Jolene didn't think he would. He sat with his back straight and his hands on his knees, and his eyes moving between the door and the window and the sleeping form of his brother, the constant triangulation of a boy who had been responsible for the safety of others for so long that his body no longer knew how to stop performing the calculation. Officer Patterson sat across from them. She had a digital recorder on the table and a notebook open to a blank page and a pen that she held loosely, not in the ready-to-write grip of an officer taking a statement, but in the loose grip of a woman who was waiting for someone to be ready. "Take your time," she said. "There's no rush." Jolene looked at the recorder. It was small and black with a single red light that blinked steadily, marking the seconds. She watched it blink. 3 times, 4, 5. Each blink a moment passing, moment in which she could still stay silent, could still say what she had said before, which was nothing, which was the safe choice, which was the choice that Rick had trained her to make through 2 years of consequences that followed every time she opened her mouth. She looked at Wyatt. The boy met her eyes. He didn't nod. He didn't signal. He just looked at her with the patient, exhausted expression of a child who has been waiting for this moment longer than a child should ever have to wait for anything. Jolene took a breath. She placed her hands flat on the table, felt the cool surface against her palms, felt the solidity of it, the realness of a thing that was exactly what it appeared to be and had no hidden dimensions, and she began to speak. She started with Marcus, because that was where it had started. Not with Rick, not with the violence, not with the locks on the doors. It had started with a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2.5 years ago, when a foreman from the construction site where Marcus worked had called to tell her that there had been an accident and that her husband was dead. Marcus had been 36. He had been the kind of man who fixed things. Not just physical things, though. He fixed those too. The leaky faucet in the stuck window, in the crooked shelf in Wyatt's room that he'd straightened 3 times because it kept listing to the left, and he'd stand there with a level and a screwdriver and a look of mild exasperation and say, "This shelf has a mind of its own." He fixed things that didn't have names, the anxious knot that Jolene carried in her stomach when the bills were late. He fixed that. The particular loneliness of being a mother in a town where she had no family, he fixed that too. Not with words. Marcus had not been a man of many words. He fixed things by being present, by being in the room, by being the kind of steady, reliable weight that you don't notice until it's gone, and then you notice it constantly in every empty chair, in every silent evening, and in the particular shape of the space where a person used to be. When he died, the space was everywhere. Jolene had managed for 4 months. She had managed the way women in her situation manage by reducing the world to its smallest necessary tasks. Get up, feed the boys, get Wyatt to school, keep Levi occupied, pay what you can, ignore what you can't, go to bed, repeat. She had managed by not thinking about the future because the future without Marcus was a field with no edges and no landmarks, and she could not afford to look at it directly. And then Rick had appeared. He had been Marcus's coworker. Not close. The kind of coworker who nods in the break room and shares a thermos of coffee on cold mornings and knows your first name, but not your middle one. He had come to the funeral. He had stood at the back, quiet, respectful. A week later, he had come to the house with 2 bags of groceries and a toolbox. Marcus mentioned the bathroom faucet, he had said. I can fix it if you want. She had let him in. Jolene paused in her telling. She looked at Officer Patterson, who was writing steadily, but not fast, giving Jolene the pace she needed. It wasn't sudden, Jolene said. That's what I need you to understand. It wasn't like he walked in one day and started hitting me. It was slow. It was the slowest thing I've ever watched happen to myself. She described it the way you describe a season changing. The imperceptible shifts. Rick started coming by more often. Then every day. Then he was there in the morning when she woke up, and there in the evening when the boys went to bed, and the space that Marcus had left, the space that had been everywhere, started to fill with someone else. And at first the filling felt like relief. He was helpful. He was present. He was good with the boys, or what passed for good in the early days, which was really just attention, just the fact of a male figure in the house who spoke to Wyatt about homework and let Levi sit on his lap during cartoons. Then the edges started to appear. A comment about Jolene's friend who came by on Tuesdays. She seems like a lot, said casually, said once. But the Tuesday visits stopped because Jolene couldn't unhear the comment and couldn't unsee the slight tightening of Rick's jaw when the friend's car pulled into the driveway. Then the phone. You don't need to talk to your sister that much. She just stresses you out. And Jolene, who had been talking to her sister in Columbus twice a week since Marcus died, found herself calling once a week, then once a month, then not at all, then the money. Rick moved in after 6 months. He paid the mortgage. He paid the utilities. He paid for everything. And what he paid for, he owned, including the decisions about how money was spent and where it went and whether Jolene could have $20 to take the boys for ice cream on a Saturday afternoon. He never said no, Jolene told Officer Patterson. He just made asking so unpleasant that I stopped. Then the first time he hit her, it was a Tuesday. She remembered that because Tuesdays had been her friend's day, and the friend didn't come anymore. And Tuesdays had become the day of the week that felt the most empty. Rick had come home from somewhere. She wasn't sure where he had stopped working by then, living on savings he never discussed, and she had asked him a question. She couldn't remember the question. Something ordinary, something about dinner or the boys or the leak in the roof that had gotten worse. He had hit her with the flat of his hand. Open palm, left side of her face, not hard enough to knock her down, just hard enough to change everything. She had stood in the kitchen with her hand on her cheek, and she had looked at him, and he had looked at her, and neither of them had spoken. And in that silence, a contract had been written. She didn't agree to it. He didn't ask her to. It just existed the way gravity exists. Invisible, inescapable. The new law of the house on Sycamore Street. After that, the architecture went up fast. The yelling, which was reserved for things she had done wrong, things that were always changing so that she could never be sure what was safe and what wasn't. The quiet that followed the yelling, which was worse because the quiet had weight, and the weight pressed down on the whole house, and everyone in it breathed differently during the quiet. The locks. The first one appeared on the boys' bedroom door 4 months after Rick moved in. A hasp and a padlock installed on the outside. Rick said it was for their own good. Said Wyatt wandered at night. Said it was a safety measure. But the lock only went on when Rick was angry, and it stayed on for hours, sometimes longer. And Jolene would stand in the hallway listening to Wyatt tell Levi that everything was fine, that it was just like camping, and her fingernails would dig into her palms until they drew blood. She had called the police once, 8 months ago, after a night when Rick had thrown a plate at the wall above Wyatt's head. The plate had shattered and a piece of ceramic had cut Wyatt's ear. Not badly, just enough for blood, just enough for Jolene to pick up the phone for the first time in a year and dial 3 numbers. The officers had come, 2 of them different from the ones who came today. They had talked to Rick in the living room while Jolene sat in the kitchen. Rick had been calm, polite, concerned. He had explained that it was a misunderstanding, that the plate had slipped, that tensions had been running high because of money and the weather and the 100 small pressures that build up in any household. He had shaken their hands when they left. 3 hours after the cruiser pulled away, Rick had locked both boys in their room and sat in the living room in the dark and said nothing for the rest of the night. Jolene had sat in the kitchen and listened to the silence and understood that she had used her one chance, and it had produced nothing except a demonstration of what happened when she tried. She had not called again. Until today. Until today, Jolene said, "I didn't call, my son did." She looked at Wyatt. The boy was listening to every word. She could see him absorbing it, processing it, fitting her account against his own memories, and finding the places where they aligned and the places where they didn't, because he had seen things from his side of the locked door that she had only heard from hers. "He's 10 years old," Jolene said, "and he did what I should have done a year ago." Officer Patterson looked up from her notebook. "You're doing it now," she said. "That matters." Jolene wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that the fact of sitting in this room, speaking these words, watching the red light blink on the recorder, constituted something meaningful. Something that would counterbalance the months of silence. The mornings when she had made breakfast while Wyatt watched her with those careful, measuring eyes, and she had known what he was asking without him saying it, and she had answered by buttering toast and pouring orange juice and not meeting his gaze. But the truth was more complicated than she was ready to articulate. The truth was that she was sitting in this room because a 10-year-old had walked out of the house in the dark and found a stranger who happened to be the kind of man who doesn't look away. She was here because of Wyatt's courage, not her own. And she knew that, and the knowing sat inside her like a stone. "Ma'am," Officer Patterson said. She closed her notebook and turned off the recorder. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it." Jolene looked at her. "I've been doing this job for 9 years. I've sat in this room with women who left after the first incident, and women who left after 10 years, and women who never left at all. And I have learned one thing." She leaned forward slightly. "It doesn't matter when you leave. It matters that you leave. You're here. You're talking. Your boys are here. That's what matters tonight." Jolene felt something crack behind her eyes. Not tears, not yet, but the pressure that precedes them. The accumulation of 2 years of holding everything in a space that was never designed to hold it all. "One more thing," Officer Patterson said. "We executed a search of the residence. In addition to the hasp block on the bedroom door, we found damage consistent with forced entry in the interior hallway wall. Patched drywall, some personal items that appeared to have been broken and repaired." She said this evenly, the way officers say things that are terrible. With control, with precision, without the emotion that the words deserve, because the emotion would make the job impossible. "We also found that the exterior deadbolts on both the front and rear doors were keyed only from the outside. There's no way to unlock them from inside the house without a key." Jolene nodded. She had known this. She had lived with it so long that she had stopped recognizing it as abnormal. The way a person who lives beside a railroad track eventually stops hearing the trains. "That's unlawful restraint," Officer Patterson said. "Among other things, combined with your statement, the prior report, the boy's statements, and the physical evidence, there's more than enough for charges. He's not going home tonight." The words landed in Jolene's chest like something warm. Not joy, not victory, something simpler. The small, exhausted relief of a person who has been holding a door shut with their body and has been told that someone has put a lock on it. "Thank you," Jolene said. Officer Patterson nodded and stood. She paused at the door. "The advocate will be in shortly. She'll help with placement for tonight and connect you with services. There's a shelter in the county that has availability. It's a good place, clean, safe staff who know what they're doing." She paused again. Your friend outside the one with the motorcycle. He's been waiting in the parking lot. Jolene looked up. He's still here. All three of them, sitting on their bikes in the snow. Jolene said nothing for a moment. Then she looked at Wyatt and Wyatt looked at her, and something passed between them that didn't need words. The particular communication that exists between a mother and a child who have survived the same storm and are standing together in the quiet that comes after. The room was quiet. Levi breathed softly on the couch. Wyatt sat in his chair. Jolene sat in hers. And for a moment, a brief suspended moment between one chapter and the next, there was nothing to do. No one to watch for. No footsteps to track. No calculation of risk to perform. Just a room with ugly walls and a sleeping child and a window full of snow. Wyatt spoke. Mom, are you mad at me? Jolene looked at him. Why would I be mad at you? For leaving this morning, for going to the diner. She studied her son's face. The careful eyes, the jaw that was still bruised but healing. The particular set of his mouth that she recognized from Marcus, the way it pulled slightly to one side when he was bracing for something. I'm not mad, she said. I should have been the one who left. A long time ago. You couldn't. I could have. I should have. Wyatt shook his head. The gesture was small but firm. You stayed because of us, because you were afraid of what would happen to us if you tried and it didn't work. Jolene stared at him. He was 10. He was 10 years old, and he had just articulated the exact dimensions of her paralysis with more clarity than she had managed in 2 years of living inside it. When did you get so smart? She asked. Her voice cracked on the last word, but she caught it and held it, and it didn't break. I'm not smart, Wyatt said. I just watched. The family advocate arrived 20 minutes later. Her name was Helen. She was in her 50s with short gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and hands that moved when she talked, not nervously, but purposefully, the hands of a person who believed that communication happened through more than words. She sat across from Jolene and spoke in a voice that was warm without being patronizing, direct without being harsh. She explained the shelter, which was 12 miles south of town, in a converted farmhouse that a local church had donated 5 years ago. She explained the services available, counseling for Jolene and the boys, legal aid for the protective order, assistance with housing and employment, a children's program staffed by people trained to work with families in transition. She said families in transition, the way someone says a phrase they've chosen deliberately, with awareness that the words matter and that the wrong ones can add weight to a person who is already carrying too much. How long can we stay? Jolene asked. Up to 90 days, sometimes longer depending on circumstances. But we'll start working on a permanent plan within the first 2 weeks. I don't have money. Rick controlled everything. I don't have access to accounts. That's common, Helen said. We have emergency funds, clothing, toiletries, food are all provided, and the legal team will help you establish your own finances as part of the separation process. Jolene listened to each piece of information as if she were building something, which she was. She was building a floor under her feet, one fact at a time. The shelter existed, the services existed, the legal help existed, the money for emergency provisions existed. Each fact was a plank, and each plank was one more thing between her and the void that she had been staring into for 2 years. The void that said, you have nothing. You are nothing without him, you are nothing. The void was wrong, it had always been wrong, but it had been very convincing because the void had spoken with Rick's voice, and Rick's voice was the voice that had filled every room in the house on Sycamore Street until there was no room left for any other sound. Do you have family nearby? Helen asked. My sister, in Columbus. We haven't spoken in over a year. Would you like to call her? Jolene felt something catch in her throat. Her sister, Margaret, who had called and eventually stopped calling because Jolene had stopped answering, because Rick had said she was a bad influence, and Jolene had been too deep inside the architecture of control to recognize that cutting her off from her sister was not protection, but isolation. Yes, Jolene said. I'd like to call her. Helen handed her a phone. It was a simple gesture, the extending of a hand holding a device, but for Jolene it carried the weight of everything that phone call represented. The sound of her sister's voice, the admission that something had gone wrong, the request for help that she had been unable to make for so long that she had almost forgotten how. She dialed the number from memory. It rang 3 times, then Margaret answered. "Hello, Meg, it's me." Silence. The silence of a person who has been waiting for a phone call for a very long time and has finally received it and does not know whether to cry or scream or simply breathe. "Joe." Margaret's voice broke on the single syllable. "Oh, Joe." "I left," Jolene said. "Tonight. The boys and I. We left." "Where are you?" "At the sheriff's station. We're going to a shelter." "I'm coming. Right now. I'm getting in the car." "Meg, it's almost 10. It's snowing." "I don't care. I don't care if it's a hurricane. I'm coming." Jolene closed her eyes. She held the phone against her ear and listened to her sister's voice, and the voice was the first voice in longer than she could remember that sounded like it belonged to someone who loved her without conditions, without contracts, without the particular fine print that Rick had written into every interaction. "Drive safe," Jolene said. "We'll be here." She handed the phone back to Helen. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, from the release. The slow, seismic release of something that had been compressed too long and was finally beginning to expand. Wyatt watched his mother. He watched the way her shoulders dropped by a half-inch, the way her hands unclenched in her lap, the way her eyes, which had been scanning the room with the same triangulating vigilance that he recognized because he performed it himself, settled on a point and stayed there. The window, the snow, the ordinary, unremarkable beauty of something falling softly in the dark. "Aunt Margaret's coming," he said. "She's coming." Wyatt nodded. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, but the careful composure that he had maintained all day, the composure that had carried him out of the house and down the street and into the diner and onto the back of a motorcycle and through everything that followed, loosened by a degree. A crack appeared in the wall, small, almost invisible, but present. His eyes filled. He turned his face away so his mother wouldn't see because he was 10 and he had been the protector and protectors didn't cry. But Jolene saw anyway because mothers always see, especially when the child turns away. She reached out and put her hand on the back of his neck. She didn't say anything. She just held the back of his neck with her hand and let him feel the weight of it, the warmth of it, the simple physical fact of a mother's hand on a child's skin. Wyatt pressed his lips together, his jaw trembled. And then for the first time all day, for the first time in longer than Jolene could remember, he let himself lean into her touch. Not stiffly, not at the edge of the booth angled toward the exit. He leaned in fully the way a child leans with the total unreserved surrender of a body that has decided to trust. Jolene pulled him to her. She held him against her chest and felt his heartbeat against her own, and she closed her eyes and breathed him in. The smell of cold air and diner hot chocolate, and the particular scent of a child who has been brave for too long and is finally tentatively allowing himself to stop. "Can I talk to him?" Jolene asked the officer who had reappeared at the door. "The man with the motorcycle, before he goes." Of course, the parking lot was cold and white. The snow had been falling steadily for the past hour, and the lot was covered in a thin, unbroken layer that glowed orange under the sodium lights. The 3 motorcycles sat in a row near the entrance, dusted with snow, their chrome details muted under the accumulation. Earl sat on his with his hands in his jacket pockets and his collar turned up and his breath making small clouds in the cold air. Boone was beside him motionless, looking at the sky with the patient attention of a man who found weather more honest than most conversations. Sawyer was leaning against his bike, reading something on his phone, squinting at the screen through the falling snow. They had been there for over an hour. Nobody had suggested leaving. Nobody had mentioned the cold, though it had settled into their joints and their fingers, in the particular places where age makes itself known. They sat in the snow because somewhere inside that building a woman was talking and 2 boys were waiting, and if you could call it a job, which none of them ever would, was not finished until the people you had decided to help were somewhere safe. Earl looked up when the door opened. He saw Jolene standing in the entrance with Wyatt beside her, and he straightened on his bike and waited. Jolene walked out into the snow. She felt it on her face, on her hair, cold and soft, each flake a separate small sensation that she had not felt in a very long time, because she had not stood outside in the open air at night in a very long time. Rick didn't like her outside at night. Rick didn't like her outside. She stopped in front of Earl. You waited, she said. Wasn't sure you'd need anything else. I don't think I do, not tonight. Earl nodded. He looked at Wyatt, who was standing beside his mother, with snowflakes collecting on the shoulders of his blue hoodie. The boy looked different, not dramatically, not in the ways that stories suggest people look different after pivotal moments. He looked the same. Same thin frame, same careful eyes, same bruise fading on his jaw. But something in his posture had shifted. The constant readiness had softened by a degree so slight that only someone who had been watching closely would have noticed it. The shoulders were a half-inch lower. The hands were at his sides instead of clenched. The eyes were still moving, still alert, still performing their constant survey of the environment, but the survey had slowed. The intervals between sweeps had lengthened, as if his body was beginning cautiously and provisionally to believe that the perimeter might hold without his constant vigilance. You did good today, Earl told him. Wyatt looked up at him. I didn't know what else to do. That's usually when people do the right thing, when they've run out of everything else. Wyatt considered this. He had a way of considering things that made Earl think he would be an extraordinary man someday if the world gave him enough room to get there. The careful way he weighed each piece of information before placing it, the respect he gave to complexity, the refusal to pretend that simple answers existed for complicated questions. Will you come back, Wyatt asked, to check on us? Earl looked at him, then at Jolene. The question sat in the cold air between them, small and serious, the kind of question that a child asks when he is really asking whether the people who showed up today will be the kind who show up again or the kind who disappear. I ride through here about once a month, Earl said, on the way to Dayton. I can stop. Wyatt nodded. He seemed satisfied with the specificity of the answer, the fact that it was grounded in a route, in a schedule rather than a vague promise. He understood at 10 that vague promises were the currency of people who intended to let you down gradually. Jolene stepped forward. She had been standing a few feet back, watching her son talk to a man she had known for less than 4 hours, and she had seen something in the exchange that she recognized. The particular gravity that pulls a boy toward a man who treats him like a person rather than a problem. The hunger for it. The way it filled a space that Marcus had left and Rick had poisoned, and Wyatt had been trying to fill himself with his vigilance and his courage and his impossible, unsustainable sense of responsibility. Thank you, she said to Earl. Not for today, I mean yes for today, but for. She stopped, started again. For not driving past. Earl looked at her. His face, which had been steady and composed all afternoon, did something that Boone and Sawyer had almost never seen. It softened, not much, just enough to let something through that he usually kept behind the leather and the silence and the miles. You did the hard part, he said. My son did the hard part. No. Earl shook his head slightly. Your son started it. You finished it. You sat in that room and talked. That's the hard part. That's always the hard part. Jolene looked at him, and for the first time since she had walked out of the house on Sycamore Street, she felt something that was not fear and not exhaustion, and not the dull weight of regret. She felt seen, not judged, not pitied, seen. The way a person is seen when someone looks at them and recognizes not what they failed to do, but what they're in the middle of doing. The particular clarity of being witnessed by someone who understands that courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of a reason to keep going despite it. You'll be all right, Earl said. He said it simply, not as a platitude, not as something he hoped or wished, as something he believed. Jolene wanted to believe it too. She wasn't there yet. She was standing in a parking lot in the snow at 9 o'clock at night with her boys in a sheriff's station behind her and a shelter ahead of her, in a future that was shapeless and terrifying and entirely for the first time in 2 years hers. We should go, she said. She reached for Wyatt's hand and the boy took it, and they stood there for a moment, the two of them in the snow, and then Wyatt let go and walked to Earl's motorcycle and put his hand on the handlebar. It's a good bike, Wyatt said. 53 years old, Earl said, rebuilt the engine twice. Wyatt ran his hand along the chrome. The snow had made this metal cold and wet, and his fingers left trails in the dusting that covered it. Thank you for the ride, Wyatt said, earlier, to the house. You held on good. I was scared. Scared people hold on the best. Wyatt looked up at him one more time. The look was the same look he had given Earl in the diner when he had been weighing whether this stranger was the kind who meant what he said. But the calculation was different now. It had been answered, and what remained was not calculation but something else. Something that looked in the orange light of the parking lot like the beginning of trust. Then he turned and walked back to his mother, and they went inside. Earl sat on his bike in the snow and watched the door close behind them. Boone and Sawyer didn't speak. They waited. The snow fell on their shoulders and on the chrome and on the pavement around them, and they sat in it like men who had been sitting in weather their whole lives and had long since stopped noticing the difference between comfort and the absence of it. After a moment, Earl reached into his jacket and pulled out the pack of cigarettes again. He looked at it. He turned it over in his hands. Then he dropped it into the trash can beside the station entrance and swung his leg over the bike. "Let's ride," he said. They rode south on Route 9 and then west on the highway toward the motel where they'd left their bags. The snow fell steadily. The road was white ahead of them and dark behind them, and the headlights carved a tunnel of light through the falling flakes. Earl rode in front the way he always did, and Boone and Sawyer flanked him, the formation as natural and practiced as breathing. Somewhere behind them, a sister from Columbus was driving through the snow toward a sheriff's station. Somewhere behind them, a man was sitting in a holding cell calculating his next move. And somewhere behind them, in a room at the end of a hallway, in a building that existed for no other purpose than to hold people who needed holding, a mother sat with her two sons and waited for the morning. The road was quiet. The world was quiet. The snow muffled everything. Sound and light and distance and time all softened, all reduced to the small circle of visibility that surrounded each rider, the immediate and the present, the pavement beneath the tires, and the air against the face and the steady rhythmic pulse of the engine. Earl thought about Jolene, not about the story she had told, though he didn't know the story, not the details, not the specifics of her telling it in a room upstairs to an officer with a notebook. He thought about the things he did know. The way she had flinched when Rick said her name. The way she had made herself small. The way she had stood at the threshold of a house she was locked inside and said, "Okay, get us out," with the quiet decisiveness of someone who was not making a single choice but was making every choice at once. All the choices she had failed to make for 2 years, compressed into 2 words and delivered to a stranger on her porch. He thought about the moment on the sidewalk when she had taken that step backward. The first step. The one that had required more strength than anything else he had witnessed today, more than Wyatt's walk to the diner, more than the confrontation with Rick, more than any of it. Because that step had been taken against 2 years of conditioning and a lifetime of the particular gravity that keeps people in the places where they are hurting, the gravity of the known. The gravity of the at least I know what this is, the terrible comfort of a pain you have already survived because at least it is familiar. She had taken that step. And then another. And then she had sat in a room under fluorescent lights and spoken aloud the things that had been locked inside her for 2 years, the way her boys had been locked inside that room, behind a hasp and a padlock on the outside of a door that should never have been closed. And somewhere in that station, at some point during the statement, or after it, she had called her sister. Earl didn't know this. He wouldn't know it. But he believed the way he believed in roads and weather and the fundamental capacity of damaged people to repair themselves, that she had reached for someone. Because that was what people did when the architecture finally fell. They reached. And he believed with the quiet certainty of a man who had watched people rebuild themselves from rubble that she would take the next step. And the one after that, not quickly, not easily, not without setbacks and doubt, and the particular voice that would say, go back, it won't be that bad this time. But she would take them, because she had 2 reasons. One was 10, one was 7, and they were sleeping now or would be soon in a room that had a lock on the inside instead of the outside, and that difference, that small mechanical difference, the placement of a lock on one side of a door versus the other was the beginning of everything. He had seen a lot of things in his years on the road, landscapes and storms and the faces of strangers, and the particular beauty of a highway at dawn when the world is the color of copper and the air smells like distance. He had seen kindness and cruelty, and the precise point where one becomes the other, and the long, slow road back. But a mother taking one step away from the man who had locked her children in a room. A 10-year-old walking a mile in the cold to ask a stranger for help. A 7-year-old eating a grilled cheese sandwich on a curb while his world rearranged itself around him. Those were the things that stayed. Levi had been right about the clouds. The snow kept falling. By the time they reached Route 12, the road was dusted white, and their headlights caught the flakes in their beams and turned them into a million points of light, each one falling at its own speed, each one landing in its own place, each one adding its own small weight to the accumulation of something that by morning would look like a world made new. That night in a room at the county shelter, Jolene lay in a narrow bed with Levi pressed against her left side and Wyatt against her right. The room was small and plain. White walls, a single window, two beds, though they were using only one because the boys had climbed in with her without asking, and she had not told them to move, and she would not have told them to move if they had stayed there for 100 years. Levi slept the way he always slept, deeply and completely, his breathing slow and even. His thumb was near his mouth again, and Jolene left it there because there were larger battles and smaller mercies, and this was a mercy she could give. Wyatt was not asleep. She could tell by his breathing, which had not yet settled into the slow rhythm of sleep, but hovered in the half space between waking and rest, the space where a body that has been vigilant all day is trying to release its watch. "Mom," he said. "Yeah. Are we going back?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the snow was still falling. She could see it in the glow of a street light, the flakes drifting through the orange cone of light and disappearing into the dark below. "No," she said. "We're not going back." Wyatt was quiet. Then he shifted closer to her, a small movement, an inch at most, the careful closing of distance that was all he knew how to offer. "Okay," he said. They lay there in the narrow bed in the small room, and the snow fell outside and the building was quiet around them. Not the quiet of Sycamore Street, which had always been the quiet of someone listening for footsteps. This was a different quiet, the quiet of a place where no one was coming down the hall, where no one was checking the locks, where the sounds of the night were just the sounds of the night and nothing more. Jolene closed her eyes. She felt Levi's warmth on her left and Wyatt's warmth on her right, and the weight of the blanket on all three of them, and she breathed. She breathed the way she hadn't breathed in 2 years, fully, deeply, filling her lungs with air that did not need to be rationed or measured or held. She thought of Marcus. Not the phone call, not the funeral, not the empty space he'd left. She thought of him fixing the shelf in Wyatt's room, the way he'd stood there with a level and a screwdriver and a look of mild exasperation at the shelf's persistent refusal to be straight. The way he'd turned to her and said, "This shelf has a mind of its own." The way she'd laughed, the ordinary sound of laughter in a house where laughter was safe. She held that image. She held it the way you hold something small and fragile that you found in the rubble of something that collapsed, carefully, with both hands, knowing that it might break again and choosing to hold it anyway. Then she slept. And the night passed and the snow kept falling, and by morning the world outside the window was white and clean and waiting to be walked across. The first footprints, not yet made the path, not yet chosen the direction unknown, but the ground solid beneath whatever step came next.